The first story I want to talk about is The Son of Satan. I don't really know where it takes place, but I do know it's in the summertime. The story has 4 physical settings. The first one is when the boys talk about confronting Simpsons. The second one is when they confront Simpsons and beat him. The third one is when the narrative go for a walk. And the last setting is when the narrative get beaten by his father. I think it's a poor social environment, both because the narrative complains about he always gets cheap shoes, and because Simpson's parents accept to take money instead of calling the police. And that gives you the impression that they really need the money. The narrative's feeling in the story is pretty mixed. He feels sorry for Simpsons and he feels like he needs to stop, but on the same time he feels it his duty to keep on going because he sees himself as the leader of their little group. His friend he just seems angry and without regret, where his other friends Morgan, he seems like he even admits that it's wrong what they're doing and they should stop. Simpson, he obviously feels terrible and afraid through the entire story. The story has 5 main characters. The narrative, who's an 11-year-old boy who lives with his parents, and the narrative's friends, Has and Morgan, who is both 12 years old. He got a little sister, but that's also the only thing we really know about them like that. Simpson is probably around the same age. You doesn't get an exact number on him, but I would guess he is the same age as the other kids. He lives with his parents and we get told that he has freckles. The narrative's father is the last character in the story. He's a huge and tall man, but we doesn't get much else to know about him. The characters are introduced in different times. We start out by knowing the narrative and his 2 friends, Has and Morgan, and later we get to know Simpsons, and in the end of the story we get to know the narrative's father. The story starts in the middle of an action, and I would say the event stretches over, 2, 3, 4 hours. The initial situation is the 3 boys who talks about confronting Simpsons. The development is when they confront him, they end up beating him, and they even end up hanging him. And the end is when the narrative, he comes home and he get beaten by his father because of what they have done. The narrative is first person. I would say he is reliable, but because he is so confused, I even doubted. But in the end, he is honest about how he feels. He tells the story how he feels it happened, and he's not trying to make you believe anything else. I would say the narrative's attitude is he feels like he's better than anyone else. He sees himself as the leader of the little group, and even against his huge father, he doesn't feel like backing down. Direct speech is without doubt dominating the story, but there's also comments and description, just not as much as the direct speech. I would say the ending is probably as open as it could be, because it's ending in the middle of an event. And the entire story was surprising me all the way through, but the end wasn't really that surprising. I had seen it coming. I think it's hard to say how I felt in the end without sounding like a complete jerk. Um, I somehow felt relief because I didn't think the narrative he should get away with what he had done, because then he might just do it again. I don't think a parent should ever lay hand on their kids, but I think it's better than nothing happened at all. But the best choice had been if the police had been contacted. um, I would say you get an impression of the atmosphere indirectly by what the character says and does, and the use of sign in the text helps you to understand both how angry the boys feel and how frightened and scared Simpson is feeling. I think the author is trying to educate with his story, and I think the message he is trying to give is that you should never be pressured into doing something that you in your heart knows wrong. And that if you're doing something you know is wrong, you gotta stop before you can take it back, before it's too late to change. That's pretty much the same moral as in the story New Girl, because that was also about a boy who did something he knew was wrong, but because of the moment and his friend, he got pressured into doing it. I would say the language is informal and it's very simple. There's a lot of slang in the story. The entire story gives the impression that it's a young person who either wrote it or that it's wrote for young people to read. The way they make words shorter is also what I mostly find young people to do, like saying I don't know, D-U-N-N-O instead of the normal I don't know. And other from that, I think the way some of the sentence is put together also make it seems like it's either to or from young people, like know my ass you won't, or damn you're damn right we will. Stuff like that you don't hear it as much in an adult world, if you can say it like that. The title of the story, it's pretty much described the narrative. It's even what his father called him in the end of the story. The second story I want to talk about is Augie Wren's Christmas Story. The story takes place in Brooklyn in USA, but when it takes place it's hard to say, especially because the story skips back and forward between time, and since it skips a lot in time, it's actually hard to say how many physical settings there is in the story. But instead of saying that the story is confusing because of all the skipping back and forward, I would say it's more intriguing. The social environment in the story is hard to say, but you get a feeling it's a busy and crowded place. Out where Ethel lives, I get the expression that it's a poor neighborhood because of she got so many locks on the door and the entire shape her apartment is in, but both of those things could be because she's in the age she's pretty old. The atmosphere in the story changes a bit with each scene, but I would say the main atmosphere in the story is actually pretty peaceful, somehow happy. In each scene you get an idea of how the character is feeling, and mostly they're actually saying it directly. There are a lot of different feelings throughout the story, but I would say the main feelings is positive feelings. There are 4 main characters in the story. The narrative, we don't know much about him, but we know that he's a writer, and he probably lives with either his wife or he doesn't live with a wife or a girlfriend. He probably lives alone. Augie Wren, he works in a cigar store. Again, we don't get much information. If I should guess, I would say he's at least 40 years old, because he met the narrative 12 years ago, and the story he tells is from before he met the narrative. So, and in the story he looks at a boy with the age 19 or 20 and says that that calls the boy a kid. And that's kind of indicate that he's at least 25 to 30 years old. The third person in the story is Robert. He was 20 years old by the time the event happened. He's a thief, that's what we know. And then he probably grew up with his grandmother. And the last person is Ethel, Robert's grandmother. She is 90 years old, and she's blind, and she lives in a shitty apartment, but that's probably also all we get to know. The story starts out with an introduction about how the narrative and Augie got to know each other. And as I mentioned, the story is jumping back and forward, so it's definitely not chronological order. The biggest part of the story, I would say, is flashbacks. The initial story is the Christmas story that the author must write. Everything before that is an introduction. It develops into the situation where Augie, he tells the author a story. When it comes to the relation between the character and the events, you could somehow say that Robert and Ethel is only there because of the events. If the author didn't have to write a Christmas story, Augie had never told the Christmas story about Robert and Ethel. And again, if Augie had never shown the narrative his lifelong work with the photos, then the story had never been about how he got his camera in the first place. The narrative is first person, and I would say he's reliable. Some might say that he's unreliable, because in the end you find out that the story wasn't even true, but he actually never said it was a true story. He only said that this is how Augie told it to me. So he actually never lied, but of course he made you think something else, but that's kinda that's your own mistake. I would say the story is meant for entertainment, but I can't figure out the theme of the story or what the author wants to say with it. If I should guess, it would be something about one man's trash is another man's treasure, or I don't know, it's better to live in a happy life just for a moment than to ruin it with the sad truth. I think the author is positive towards the events and characters. You don't look bad at any of them because of the way they are displayed. Even Robert, who is a thief, and he doesn't even visit his old grandmother. You doesn't look that bad at him, because the way Orge tells it, you feel sorry for him. He's just a poor kid ending up in trouble, and probably doesn't have the support or the help to get out of the trouble. You know, you get a different perspective of them, and that's why I also think that the story is kind of peaceful and happy, because you don't look down or you don't look bad at any of the characters. The language is pretty simple, and I would say it's informal. I was expecting a different kind of story. I was expecting more of a typical Christmas story, something with the fairy tales and love and family and all that kind of stuff. But it's definitely not just a typical Christmas story. I would say it's some very different relations we see in the two stories. The first story is about the three boys who maybe isn't good for each other, but they end up being friends, and because of their friendship they end up in a lot of troubles, and they end up, I don't know, somehow make each other do stupid stuff as they maybe wouldn't have done if they had other friends. Where the other story is about two friends you wouldn't expect to be friends, but because of their mutual interest in art, for example, they end up being friends because of the connection that they has. So it's some very different relationship there is in the story. One of them tells about how friendship can influence you in a bad way, and the other story tells about how a friendship can be kind of joyful for you and can help you with stuff in your life that you didn't expect it to help you with. Yeah.